What if Atlantis was never a place waiting to be found, but a story designed to be remembered? For more than 2,000 years, people have searched oceans and ruins for Plato's lost island. Even though the strongest clue may be that Atlantis began as an argument, not a map. Atlantis feels ancient in a very particular way. Even people who have never read Plato usually know the outline. A rich island, advanced architecture, harbors and canals. Then a sudden destruction beneath the sea. The image is so familiar that it can seem older than its actual source. But the trail does not begin in a forgotten temple or an underwater excavation. It begins in writing. Around 360 BCE, Plato introduced Atlantis in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. That is the earliest known full account. In those works, Atlantis is not simply scenery. It is part of a moral and political story. This matters because Atlantis entered history already fully narrated. It comes with kings, engineering, war, and divine punishment. It appears all at once in the hands of one of the ancient world's most influential philosophers. That does not automatically mean Plato invented every detail from nothing. Ancient authors often reshaped older tales. But it does mean the legend begins not with evidence in the ground, but with a literary voice on the page. And once that is clear, the question changes. Instead of asking only where Atlantis was, we also have to ask why Plato wanted it to exist at all. In Plato's account, Atlantis was a great island power lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the place Greeks usually associated with the Strait of Gibraltar. The island was wealthy and fertile. Its capital was arranged in striking rings of land and water. There were harbors crowded with ships, monumental temples, and engineered canals. It was a place of abundance and design. At first, the Atlanteans were said to live in harmony with the divine order set by Poseidon. But over time, prosperity became corruption. Power turned outward. Atlantis grew aggressive and sought to dominate other peoples. In Plato's telling, only primordial Athens resisted it with virtue and courage. Then came the end. In a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The city, the empire, and its ambition disappeared almost at once. It is easy to see why later readers treated this as history. Plato gives numbers, geography, genealogy, and vivid architecture. The details feel concrete, but the structure of the story is just as important as the details. Atlantis rises, becomes proud, and falls. It is a moral arc as much as a place. That rhythm should sound familiar because it is how cautionary tales are built. One phrase in Plato's story has shaped centuries of searching. Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. For Greek readers, that usually meant the gateway at the western edge of the Mediterranean, near the Strait of Gibraltar. In other words, Plato was pointing away from Greece and toward the Atlantic. That location gave the tale a feeling of distance and scale. The world beyond the pillars was real, but also hazy. It was close enough to imagine and far enough to remain uncertain. For a storyteller, that is powerful terrain. Later generations took the phrase very literally. If Atlantis was beyond Gibraltar, then perhaps it was in the Atlantic Ocean, near the Azores, off Spain in North Africa, or somewhere now submerged. Others argued Plato was being symbolic, not cartographic. Some suggested that he blended known geography with a philosophical setting, much as later writers would do in utopian fiction. This is one of the first places where the legend splits in two. One Atlantis is a coordinate to be plotted. The other is a stage, carefully placed at the edge of the known world, so that it feels plausible, grand, and just out of reach. That second Atlantis may be the more important one. Plato does not simply say, "I made up a story." Instead, he gives Atlantis a pedigree. In the dialogues, the tale is presented as an old Egyptian account told to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, then carried down through generations until it reaches Critias. This framing device is important. Egyptian civilization was ancient even by Greek standards. To attach a story to Egyptian priests was to give it age, authority, and the weight of deep memory. It made Atlantis sound inherited rather than invented. But there is a problem. No independent ancient Egyptian source confirms this transmission. We do not possess an Egyptian text that tells the Atlantis story in the form Plato describes. That absence does not prove Plato had no inspiration at all. Stories can travel without leaving neat records. But it does mean the Egyptian chain of custody cannot be verified. Many scholars therefore treat the Egyptian setting as part of Plato's literary craft. It lends seriousness. It creates distance. It allows the philosopher to present a dramatic account without claiming direct authorship in the plainest way. In other words, Atlantis may have been designed to feel old from the moment it appeared. That too is part of how legends are made. They arrive already wearing the costume of antiquity. Today, most classical scholars treat Atlantis primarily as a philosophical myth or allegory, rather than straightforward history. Not because the story is dull, but because it fits so well with Plato's habits as a writer. Plato often used dialogues, invented speeches, and carefully arranged examples to explore political and ethical ideas. In Atlantis, the contrast is sharp. On one side stands a virtuous, disciplined, ancient Athens. On the other stands a wealthy imperial power that has lost its moral balance. The confrontation is almost too perfect. Then there is the ending. Atlantis does not merely lose a war. It is erased by earthquakes and floods after moral decline. That pattern reflects a familiar ancient theme. Human arrogance grows, divine order answers, catastrophe restores proportion. There is also the practical issue of evidence. Antiquity preserved Plato's account and later discussion of it. But no independent historical tradition firmly establishes Atlantis as a known state. Archaeology has not produced decisive confirmation of the city, empire, or ringed capital as Plato described them. A remark often linked to Aristotle says that the man who invented Atlantis also made it disappear. The wording survives only through later transmission, so scholars treat it cautiously. Still, the sentiment captures an old suspicion. Even in the ancient world, not everyone was convinced. Even if Atlantis is mainly a Platonic invention, that does not settle every question. A fictional story can still borrow from real fears and real events. The ancient Mediterranean knew earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and the collapse of powerful states. Catastrophe was not theoretical. That is why some researchers and many popular writers have looked to the Bronze Age Aegean, especially the eruption on Thera, modern Santorini. The blast was one of the most destructive volcanic events in the region's history. It affected surrounding islands and may have contributed to wider disruption in the Minoan world. The comparison is tempting. A maritime culture, sudden devastation, memories of a flourishing society broken by nature. Yet the match is far from exact. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, not in the Aegean. His chronology and political framing also do not line up neatly with what archaeology tells us about Minoan Crete or Santorini. So the Thera connection remains a hypothesis, not a solution. It may help explain how certain images in the story feel convincing, but it does not transform Plato's narrative into confirmed history. What it does show is something else. Atlantis endures partly because it sits where memory and imagination naturally overlap. After Plato, Atlantis did not vanish, but it also did not dominate every age. In late antiquity and the Middle Ages, the story survived mainly through the preservation of Platonic texts and commentary. It was known, discussed, and copied, yet it was not always the obsession it would later become. The change came with the revival of classical learning in Renaissance Europe. As Plato circulated more widely, Atlantis returned to view in a new intellectual climate. Europeans were rethinking geography, rediscovering ancient literature, and looking at newly expanded maps of the world. The old island beyond the Western Gateway suddenly felt newly relevant. Atlantis also became useful for writers imagining ideal societies. In 1627, Francis Bacon published New Atlantis, a utopian work that borrowed the name while moving further from Plato's original political setting. This was a turning point. Atlantis was no longer just a cautionary tale from a Greek dialogue. It was becoming a flexible symbol. That flexibility mattered. Once the name detached from Plato's exact purpose, it could travel into geography, fiction, philosophy, empire, and fantasy. The lost island was no longer one story. It was a container for many stories ready for each new age to fill. If Plato gave Atlantis its birth, the 19th century gave it a second life. In 1882, the American writer Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book argued that Atlantis had been a real prehistoric civilization and the common source of many later cultures. This was a decisive shift. Donnelly did not treat Atlantis mainly as moral philosophy. He treated it as hidden world history. Similar myths across continents, monumental architecture, flood stories, and fragments of ancient lore were gathered into one grand explanation. Atlantis became the vanished mother civilization behind everything. Mainstream archaeology has not accepted that case. The evidence was selective, speculative, and often built on superficial parallels rather than firm historical links. But Donnelly's influence was enormous. He gave modern Atlantis hunting a template that still survives today. After Donnelly, Atlantis was no longer simply a lost island. It became an origin story for mysterious knowledge, forgotten migrations, and civilizational decline. Later, occult and esoteric writers expanded it even further, adding secret wisdom, vanished races, and spiritual destinies. In a sense, this is when the Atlantis most people imagine today was truly invented. Not in Plato's academy, but in the modern age of alternative history, print culture, and popular speculation. Once Atlantis became a global mystery, it could be placed almost anywhere. The Atlantic Islands, Spain, North Africa, the Caribbean, Antarctica. Even underwater structures of uncertain origin have been drafted into the story. Each theory promises that the real location has finally been found. But this constant relocation reveals something important. Atlantis is persuasive precisely because it is so adaptable. Plato's details are vivid enough to inspire a search, yet flexible enough to support competing maps. If one theory fails, the legend simply moves. Mainstream archaeology remains unconvinced by these claims because decisive evidence is missing. There is no universally accepted site that matches Plato's description, date, scale, and context. There are ruins, disasters, and intriguing landscapes. But intriguing is not the same as proven. And yet, the search continues. Partly because a lost civilization is inherently compelling. Partly because modern audiences are drawn to the idea that official history has missed something vast. Atlantis offers both wonder and dissent at the same time. That may be why it survives every disappointment. The legend is not weakened by uncertainty. Uncertainty is the oxygen that keeps it alive. Perhaps the strangest thing about Atlantis is that it has never stayed in the ancient world. It keeps sinking again in each new century, carrying new fears with it. For Plato, it reflected questions about power, virtue, and political order. For Renaissance thinkers, it could suggest distant lands and ideal societies. For modern writers, it became a warning about collapse, a dream of hidden wisdom, or proof of a lost golden age. Its imagery helps: the ringed city, the bright temples, the sea closing over stone. Plato's urban description is so vivid that artists, filmmakers, and theorists have rebuilt Atlantis thousands of times without a single confirmed ruin. The picture survives because it is architecturally memorable and emotionally complete. There is also a deeper reason. Atlantis speaks to a permanent human anxiety, that flourishing societies are fragile, that wealth can blind a people, that nature can erase what pride assumes is permanent. These themes do not age, so when we ask why Atlantis remains persuasive after centuries without proof, the answer may be simple. It is not carried forward by evidence alone, it is carried by usefulness. Atlantis gives every era a lost world shaped exactly like its own hopes and fears. And that is why the legend was never really lost.